Thank you so much for everyone for coming to this event about examining the intersection of infectious disease and extreme weather. We have really exciting speakers today. But my name is Kayoko Shioda. I'm an assistant professor of global health at Boston University School of Public Health. I'll be moderating this event with Dr. David Hamer, who is a professor of global health and medicine at BU as well. So let me introduce the first speaker, Dr. Kacey Ernst. So Dr. Ernst is a professor and chair of epidemiology and biostatistics at the University of Arizona's Mel and Enid Zuckerman College of Public Health. And her work focuses on how environmental and social factors, including extreme weather, shape the transmission of infectious diseases such as malaria, dengue, and Zika. She has conducted her research in Kenya, Indonesia, Mexico, the southwestern United States, where she studies vector ecology, transmission dynamics, and community-based prevention. And she's a leader in integrating extreme weather and health data to improve early warning systems and strengthen resilience to extreme weather-sensitive health threats. So thank you so much, Dr. Ernst. The floor is yours.
Great, thank you all. So thanks for inviting me today. I'm going to try to sort of set the stage here for our broader discussion of extreme weather events and infectious diseases. I'll start with a broad framing and then talk about a few case studies from my own work. So next slide, please. So everyone is aware that extreme weather events have been widely increasing since the 1980s in the United States. Next slide. And as discussed in the National Climate Assessment 5, a person born in 2020 on average will experience more extreme weather events than those born in 1965. Some of those greatest changes are going to occur in tropical cyclones, droughts, and heat waves to the right of the figure here. Next slide. In the United States, these disasters are often widespread, but this is 2024 data, but it really shifts year to year in the geographic areas that they impact. And so all parts of and regions in the United States are experiencing some of these extreme weather events that are occurring. Next slide. And if you zoom out globally for that same year, 2024, you can see that the World Meteorological Society was reporting major flooding in nearly every region in the world and drought events in many. And this was just in one single year. Next slide. So when you start overlaying the burden of infectious disease as compiled by the Global Burden of Disease Study here, you can see that there's a lot of significant overlap between where we have extreme weather events occurring and where we have a high burden of infectious diseases. Next slide. So when I was asked to sort of give this talk, one of the sort of questions is, how do you actually broadly talk about how infectious diseases are affected by extreme weather? Because it's extremely complicated, right? So it was felt like a bit of a daunting task. So what I did here was I tried to explain sort of the myriad pathways and feedback loops and complexities are very hard to capture in a 20-minute talk. So this conceptual framework is really trying to describe how different extreme weather events, singly or in compounding sort of cascades of and hazards, leads to disruptions of components of the socio-ecological model, which is a really well-established framework that talks about how different levels of, at the broader policy level, at the neighborhood level, at the individual and household level, your environment really shapes your health. And that's also true with infectious diseases. And sort of marrying that with our traditional classic infectious disease host pathogen environment, and then sort of the driving engine here is the reproductive number and how all of these sort of pathways cascade to influence things like the contacts per unit time, the probability of transmission per contact, and the duration of infectiousness. So that all of these sort of cluster together to really alter and shift broadly the infectious disease dynamics of pretty much all modes of transmission that we have. And then, of course, adaptation and resilience capacity means that just because you have a flooding event in a specific geographic area one year, if it occurs in a different geographic area that has different adaptive capacity, resilience capacity, it could be a very different picture as to what actually occurs in the transmission dynamics. Next slide. So when thinking about sort of this by mode of transmission, some pathways of impact may become more common. This is by no means some sort of accurate depiction of the relative weight of these factors, but I just want to use this to illustrate that there are different patterns by how these diseases are transmitted. So something like a respiratory disease or a sexually transmitted infection are going to be largely sort of maybe shaped by changing contact patterns, while something like vector-borne diseases, which is actually more accurately modeled through something like the vectorial capacity equation, is more broadly influenced through pathways of probability of transmission within the mosquito system. So extreme weather is not going to uniformly increase transmission. There's a lot of complexities here, and there are drivers that both enhance as well as reduce and suppress transmission depending upon the extreme weather event that's occurring, as well as the geographic system in which it is occurring. Next slide. So I want to sort of delve a little bit into an area that I am actually not as familiar with, but I had a really, I really found it intriguing to explore sort of this more or less commonly sort of associated with extreme weather events of sexually transmitted infections. And so what I found was that there are a lot of drivers and connections between extreme weather events and sexually transmitted infections. So while this is not my specific area of research, I think it's important to illustrate that these connections have very different pathways than we might normally think of with extreme weather and infectious disease. So predominantly, sexually transmitted infection acts through disruptions to food and economic security. So there's evidence that suggests that this can increase transactional sex, reduce individuals' willingness to comply with ARTs, given the side effects with low food security, reduce screening and increase the duration of infectiousness with healthcare system disruptions. And then resilience strategies are also largely driven to reduce the economic shock and ensure stability of medical care access. Next slide. So some of the same elements apply to flooding and mosquito-borne diseases, which is a little bit more in my wheelhouse. There's disruptions to housing quality, which can lead to increased biting rates, disruption of healthcare systems and public health surveillance systems. But also there's a much more dominant pathway between shifting breeding sites, alterations in humidity, and the biological impacts on mosquito density and survival. Next slide. So the figure that was shown on the previous slide is really illustrating our sort of thinking around the causal pathways, but this is the results of the review that was conducted by Dr. Coulson. So we identified that past literature shows that the greatest impact on mosquito-borne diseases is really occurring 1 to 4 months post-event, with some suggested decreases in those earliest window, possibly due to reductions in adults or flushing of oviposition sites. But one thing we identified that is really important is that this is complicated thing to study, right? So researchers in the literature were defining floods differently. There was inconsistency in how the outcome is captured, or if they even had pre-flooding data, or if they had a control group. There's also a lot of challenges with disruptions in data collection that can make it difficult to really disentangle surveillance artifacts from real shifts in transmission. And many of these studies, as I mentioned, didn't have a control group. So I think we also need to keep in mind that as we continue to study these relationships, that we embed standards and rigor in how we assess these. Next slide. So in a follow-up study that was led by Dr. Ellen Santos, who's formerly in my lab, we paired flooded municipalities with an unflooded municipality that had similar population density, that had a similar proportion of piped water within the same state, and then looked at differences in weekly dengue incidence. Next slide. So what we see here is that there is this sort of collision between two different extreme weather events, drought and flooding. So looking at these pre and post events, so the middle of the timeline here, 0, is when the actual event occurred. And so we identified that in connecting this with drought, under normal conditions, the increase was again around that 4 to 6 week time frame, but it was pretty minimal. But when you had higher levels of drought, sort of in panel B and C, you really had a significant increase in dengue patterns following the flooding event. Next slide. So what do we start to do with some of these this information that we glean on these relationships? I think leveraging them into forecast and early warning systems, which I think some of our panelists will talk about, can be really helpful, making sure that it's simple but also accessible for both community and decision makers is critically important. Next slide. I also want to talk about sort of the flip, the reverse. So what we're doing to adapt to extreme weather events can also influence infectious disease transmission. So, you know, here in Arizona, we're really hot and we have extreme heat that leads to a lot of mortality and heat-related illnesses that are occurring. And so we have a really strong effort to try to reduce that heat exposure in our populations. Next slide. So this is our beautiful natural desert environment. Go ahead and click through. And what we do, next slide again, keep clicking through, is we start transforming our desert environment. As you can see sort of around the periphery here, this is Phoenix and Maricopa County. You can see on the periphery, it's really dry. But when you start going into the interior of Phoenix, there's a lot of greenness. And so when we assessed sort of, next slide, so Maricopa County is pretty cool in that they set 800 traps on a weekly basis to capture mosquitoes across the county. And what we found is that when you had a higher proportion of that buffer around the trap as shade cover, you had not only an increased abundance of Aedes aegypti females, but you also had a broader peak. So it started to increase earlier in the season and decline later in the season. Next slide. So we repeated this experiment in Mexico, in Hermosillo, with our colleague, Dr. Marisela Montalvo Corral, who's and she basically went ahead and looked at really high vegetation shade areas and really low, and then compared them, and then conducted mosquito trapping in those areas and looked at the relative abundance. Next slide. So what she found was relatively similar to what we were finding in the really extensive Maricopa County data set. You have higher levels of abundance in these areas that have higher shade cover. So it's really important to start considering not only sort of that direction where we have the extreme weather event affecting the dynamics of the disease systems, but also what we're doing to try to shore up our resilience. How does that also influence these infectious diseases? Next slide. So I'll leave you with the takeaway. We really need to have these critical, nuanced social, ecological, and biological approaches to understanding the impacts of extreme weather events on specific pathogens. And then once we actually know those relationships, we can start doing some forecasting and early warning. But we also need to approach adaptation and mitigation strategies with this broader ecosystem perspective in mind to reduce maladaptation strategies. So broadly, programs that shore up our current infrastructure for today will also make us more resilient for the future. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for the great presentation, Dr. Ernst. I forgot to mention at the beginning, but we are taking questions at the end of the event following the panel discussion. So if you have any questions, please feel free to type those under the Q&A tab. I think you can see it on your screen. So we will take those at the end. So let me introduce our second speaker, Dr. Quinn Adams. So Dr. Quinn Adams is a postdoc researcher at the University of Colorado Boulder who recently completed a PhD in environmental epidemiology at the Boston University School of Public Health, where their research focused on the health risks of extreme weather events and how environmental conditions shape infectious disease dynamics. And her work includes weather-sensitive diseases and urban health, including research on weather extremes and vector-borne diseases like leishmaniasis. And she's now leading efforts supported by the US NSF to develop the predictive models for vector-borne diseases such as West Nile virus in the US. With that, I will hand things over to Dr. Adams.
Thank you so much for the intro, and thanks for having me. Today I'm going to talk about how weather and climate shape vector-borne diseases and how we can actually use that information to anticipate outbreaks in advance. Next slide, please. So before we dive into specific climate drivers, it's worth asking why vector-borne diseases are particularly sensitive to climate. So disease vectors like mosquitoes and ticks and sandflies, they're cold-blooded organisms, meaning their biology is entirely at the mercy of its surrounding environment. And so in short, climate kind of governs nearly every step of the transmission chain. And so that's what makes this relationship really important to understand. So first, temperature. We have warmer conditions accelerate how quickly pathogens develop and vectors like mosquitoes reproduce. It also changes how both vectors and their hosts behave, where they go, how they act, and when. And second, precipitation. Rainfall can create new breeding habitats or wipe out existing ones. Third, extremes, droughts, floods, windstorms, heat waves can entirely disrupt established transmission patterns in ways that can be pretty hard to predict. And most importantly, these effects are nonlinear, delayed, and highly context-specific, as we saw from Dr. Ernst, which makes them both really fascinating, but also very hard to model. Next slide, please. So that brings us to the central question of this talk. Can we actually anticipate outbreaks in advance using weather? So to explore that, I'm going to focus on two disease systems, each with a different vector, a different host cycle, and a different geographic context. So the first is West Nile virus in the United States. This is a mosquito-borne disease that cycles through birds as its primary host, with humans as incidental dead-end hosts, so they don't contribute to the further transmission of disease. It's now endemic across much of North America, and it shows pretty striking year-to-year variability that we think weather plays a pretty important role in driving. And the second disease system is visceral leishmaniasis in Brazil, otherwise known as VL. This is a sandfly-borne disease that cycles through domestic dogs as the key reservoir before spilling over into human populations. And this is a serious and often fatal disease if untreated, and Brazil carries one of the heaviest burdens globally. So these two systems kind of give us a chance to look at climate-disease relationships from different angles. We have different vectors, different transmission cycles, and different climates. And in the rest of the talk, I'll use them as kind of case studies, both to understand how weather shapes disease risk, but to also ask whether we can use weather data to predict where and when outbreaks are likely to occur. Next slide, please. Okay, so now before diving into the results, I want to briefly lay out the analytical strategy. So when we talk about using weather to understand and anticipate disease, we're actually asking two fundamentally different questions. So the first is what drives disease outbreaks and where? This is an estimation problem. And the second is what will happen next and how severe will it be? That is a prediction problem. And I'd argue that you need the first before you can do the second well. So on the estimation side, what we do is use what's called a Bayesian spatiotemporal modeling framework fit with INLAW, or integrated nested Laplace approximation, which basically just lets us handle the kind of rare and sparse count data that you get with diseases like West Nile and VL across hundreds of small geographic units. And then we also pair this with what are called distributed lag nonlinear models, or DLNMs, which are designed to specifically capture the fact that climate effects on disease aren't immediate. They can unfold over weeks or months, and then the relationship is often nonlinear. And the Bayesian framework also means that we're propagating full uncertainty through every estimate. And then on the prediction side, we take a different approach. So here we use machine learning, specifically extreme gradient boosting. This is structured to mimic a real prospective forecasting system. That means the model only ever sees data that would have been available at the time the forecast was made. So essentially no peeking into the future. And we generate forecasts at 1, 3, 6, and 12 months ahead, targeting multiple decision relevant outcomes. And then importantly, we use what's called explainable AI, otherwise known as SHAP values, to attribute which weather features are actually driving each forecast. And together, these two models kind of give us a way to both understand climate disease relationships deeply and operationalize that understanding into something that could actually support early warning. All right, next slide, please. So here's that pipeline kind of start to finish, just 5 steps that take us from raw climate signals to actionable public health decisions. So we start with data processing, pulling together and integrating weather and disease data at the right geographic scale. From there, we do lag identification, kind of accounting for the biology of each disease system to understand how delayed those weather effects actually are. And then that feeds into the spatiotemporal model, again, using Bayesian in-law to handle uncertainty, spatial clustering, effect modifiers. And then we move into the rolling forecast, extreme gradient boosting, running in forward prediction with SHAP values to keep it interpretable. And then finally, all of that gets translated into decision products. So things that like threshold exceedance probabilities or peak timing or burden classification that are actually useful in public health action and decision making. All right, next slide, please. So with that framework in place, let's put it to work, starting with VL in Brazil. Next slide. So VL is a really complex zoonotic system, sandflies, dog reservoirs, human spillover, and it's also fatal without treatment. So burden is concentrated in the hot and dry northeast and central Brazil, and it's increasingly urban, spreading into kind of these underserved city peripheries where poverty helps to amplify risk. And the core question is, can we actually detect a meaningful climate signal in a system that is this complex? Next slide, please. And the answer is yes. So what we did was we used monthly confirmed VL cases from the Ministry of Health in Brazil and monthly average temperature from the ERA 5 land reanalysis dataset to calculate anomalies, which reflect deviation from the local baseline. So for example, this would tell you October is 2 degrees hotter than usual this year. So we implemented our Bayesian spatiotemporal model framework, and from this approach, we can see how short-term heat anomalies are associated with changes in VL risk and how these effects vary over time. So if you look at the lines in red and dark purple, we're looking at the lag response relationship when temperatures are 1 and 3 degrees higher than normal. So we see that increases in temperature anomalies are associated with an increased VL risk about 1 to 3 months later. And in other words, unusually hot conditions are associated with a delayed risk in VL. And then on the other hand, colder than normal conditions are associated with a decrease in VL risk. Next slide, please. But the temperature signal doesn't look the same everywhere. So this figure explores associations between temperature anomalies and VL risk and how they change depending on local land use and urbanization characteristics. So the panels are grouped by 2 key modifiers. On the left, we split by urbanization level, high versus low, and then on the right by whether the area is deforested or non-deforested. And the effect is stronger and more consistent in low urbanization and deforested areas. So these communities might be more vulnerable to heat-driven transmission dynamics. And overall, the takeaway is that the impact of climate anomalies on disease risk is pretty heavily shaped by land use and infrastructure. So we can estimate the climate VL relationship, but can we actually use weather to forecast outbreaks? Next slide, please. And once again, the answer is yes. So as a reminder, we use extreme gradient boosting here. And on the left, you'll see results from a model predicting case counts over time. Overall, it actually performs pretty well. So we're capturing the seasonal dynamics and much of the variability across different cities. And then across locations, the prediction interval was around 80%, meaning that in 80% of months, the true observed cases fell within the model's predicted uncertainty range. So not only are we predicting the average trend pretty well, we're also doing a reasonable job capturing uncertainty. But the challenge is now that predicting exact case counts isn't always that actionable. So public health systems don't respond to 7 versus 9 cases. They tend to respond to fresh thresholds. So we reframed this problem. Instead of predicting counts, we built a classification model to predict whether a location would exceed the Ministry of Health's threshold that triggers intervention. So on the right, you'll see that this performs well across multiple metrics, especially the area under the curve, meaning that we can reliably distinguish high-risk periods from low ones. There's a lot of variability, but overall, these metrics perform decently well. Next slide, please. And then we can also look at which variables contributed meaningfully to our predictions, kind of getting out of the black box of machine learning. So at the top, we see that human footprint, the Oceanic Niño Index, and urban coverage were consistently among the most influential predictors of high risk across Brazil. We also see that other influential features include things like lagged case counts, wind speed, HIV co-infection. These really just highlight the importance of incorporating both past epidemiological and climatic context in these types of models. Next slide, please. And then when we look at how feature distributions differ for individual locations, the leading predictors actually look quite different. So without going into too much detail on these very detailed graphs, we see that Arguayna, for example, is really strongly driven by the El Nino Southern Oscillation. And São Luís, on the other hand, is driven pretty heavily by historical case counts and human footprint. So the model is able to capture real heterogeneity, and a generalizable framework needs to be this flexible to capture this and also interpretable enough so that we can communicate what we find to decision makers. All right, next slide, please. Sorry, my dog. So now let's turn to West Nile virus in the United States. So this is a very different system, but the same core question. So West Nile virus is a mosquito or a bird mosquito cycle. So humans are also dead end hosts who get infected incidentally. Most people who are infected never know it, but a small fraction develop neuroinvasive disease, which can be severe and fatal. So look at the incidence map on the left here. This was created by my colleague, Dr. Ryan Harp. And one thing really jumps out immediately. The burden lines up almost perfectly with the central flyway. So migratory birds are amplifying hosts, and their movement corridors are shaping where transmission is most intense. So despite being technically present across much of the country, the real burden is really remarkably concentrated. So fewer than 5% of US counties account for the vast majority of cases. And it's also really highly seasonal. So cases peak July through September when mosquito populations are at their height, and the virus has had time to amplify through bird populations throughout the summer. Next slide, please. So temperature is probably the most important climate driver for West Nile, or at least the most clear one. On the left, these are models based on lab data from Shockett and colleagues, and these are of the 4 main Culex vector species. They all show peak transmission efficiency around 23 to 25 degrees Celsius with a really hard cutoff on either side. So too cold, the virus can't replicate it fast enough, or too hot, the vector survival drops off really sharply. And what's exciting is that when we actually apply our spatiotemporal modeling framework that I outlined previously to human case data across different ecological regions across the United States, we can replicate this relationship almost exactly. So this is a really similar unimodal curve peaking around 25 degrees Celsius and collapsing at the extremes. And this is remarkably consistent in shape across regions, even though we see quite a bit of difference in magnitude. So the biology on the left and the epidemiology on the right are telling really the same story. Temperature is very clearly embedded in this transmission cycle. And so now that we've established this climate signal, let's see if we can actually use it to forecast. Next slide. Okay, so what you're looking at here is what's called the skill score. This measures improvement over basically a best historical baseline, or what's referred to as a null model. So a positive value means our weather-driven model is adding real value beyond just surveillance history alone. And raw case counts are basically unforecastable. So that's the gray row on the top. And honestly, that's expected. Exact case counts are noisy and really hard to pin down, especially for diseases like West Nile, where cases are rare. But when we reframe the question into things that actually matter more for public health decisions, things like, will there be any cases? Will it be above the median? Is this going to be an outbreak? What's the risk category? The skill jumps up pretty substantially. And the 2 highlighted cells, in my opinion, tell the most interesting story. So outbreak detection is actually strongest in the shoulder season, May, June, and October, and not at the peak. And that sounds counterintuitive at first, but it makes sense. So in the peak season, historical mean is actually already a strong baseline. Everyone knows that July is West Nile season. The model's real advantage is capturing anomalous early and late season transmission that the null weather independent model completely misses. And that's the exact kind of signal that you might need for preseason resource positioning before the outbreak arrives and not after. Next slide, please. And what's actually driving this forecast under the hood? So the plot on the left, again, shows feature importance, and 2 things tend to jump out. So seasonality is the dominant signal, which makes sense. West Nile virus is highly seasonal. But right behind it are these really long lag temperature features, lags of 4, 9, 10 months, highlighted here in orange. And this might seem surprising at first, but the biology on the right is what explains it. So an August outbreak isn't set in motion in August. It was set in motion the previous winter and spring. So mild winters mean better overwintering, mosquito survival. Warm springs accelerate bird migration and early viral amplification. And then by the time mosquito populations explode in June and July, the conditions for a bad summer were already kind of written months earlier. So when the model looks back 9 or 10 months, it's basically recovering biological memory of the whole transmission system. Next slide, please. So where does this go next? There's 3 directions for this type of research that I think are really important. The first is understanding and leveraging climate change and range shifts. So the relationships that we've estimated are based on historical climate, but as temperature and precipitation regimes shift, so will the geographic footprint of these diseases. The next is moving from retrospective to prospective forecasting. What we've built here is kind of a rigorous proof of concept, but the goal is a system that actually is running in real time. So ingesting weather data, updating forecasts, pushing out early warnings ahead of the season. And then third is integrating with decision making. And this is probably the hardest part, but a forecast is only useful if it changes what someone does. Next slide, please. So we'll leave you with some key takeaways. The first is that locally defined weather carries disease signal that can help us understand outbreaks in advance. Also, different lags reveal kind of different mechanistic relationships. We see 2 months as important for VL and longer lags for West Nile. Also, context determines the magnitude. We saw that deforestation, land cover, and ecoregion tend to modulate how much weather matters for transmission. An association also enables us to build forecasts. So the same properties that explain past outbreaks can give us 3 or more months of actionable early warning lead time. Next slide, please. Thank you so much. I am very happy to take questions at the end.
Yes, thank you so much. Sorry, it took a time for me to unmute myself, but thank you so much for a great presentation, Dr. Adams. So we will have a Q&A session at the end. So let me introduce our third speaker, Dr. Jeffery Shaman. Dr. Shaman is a professor of environmental health science at Columbia University's Mailman School of Public Health. And he is an infectious disease epidemiologist and a modeler who uses advanced statistical and mathematical approaches to understand and forecast disease transmission, including leading influential work during the COVID-19 pandemic to estimate undocumented infections, assess reinfection risk, and project outbreak trajectories. His team's real-time projections informed decision-making at the White House, CDC, hospital systems, and public health agencies, as well as major clinical trials. And his broader research also explores how environmental and social dynamics shape infectious disease patterns and population health. So now I will turn it over to Dr. Shaman to begin his presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Shioda. And let me just add, you'll see Columbia Climate School on the left there. My primary appointment actually is shifted to the Climate School at Columbia, though I'm still jointly appointed at the Mailman School of Public Health. It's a pleasure to be here. I thought I would talk a little more broadly about some of the challenges and approaches that I think are needed to actually address issues from a research perspective at the nexus of climate change, extreme weather, and infectious disease. So I'm going to go into this and I'm going to give some context in a number of directions. Next slide, please. So I like to start with this in sort of a historical bent. This is the oldest reference to malaria I've ever come across. If you read Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, which is considered one of the first histories ever written, if not the first, and you make it to book 7, it'll talk about the destruction of the Athenian expedition at Syracuse. And I'm just going to read it. He writes, obviously in Greek, not in English, but the translation is, after a particularly devastating battle, the Athenian generals consulted upon the disaster which had happened and upon the general weakness of the army. They saw themselves unsuccessful in their enterprises and the soldiers disgusted with their stay. disease being rife among them owing to its being the sickly season of the year and to the marshy and unhealthy nature of the spot in which they were encamped. That last clause there is that old reference to malaria. He wrote this around 404 BC, I believe. And the disease they're referring to is malaria. This is well before germ theory, well before the mosquito had been identified as the vector of malaria. But there was a recognition that if you were in a marshy spot at a summertime in Sicily, as the case may be, that you would be exposed to something that would cause disease of a certain nature. This is something that humans cataloged, they recognized, they had a loose understanding of, and certainly as they began to write and document things and move forward with things like medical geography, this is something that they really began to understand and intuit, but also organize. Next slide, please. If we fast forward to now, we still have these kinds of information actually afforded to the public. So this is something from the Lung Institute that categorizes the best and worst places to live with chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. And their assessment of this, maybe it's loose, maybe it's more quantitatively backed, but it's based on access to hospitals, air quality, and climate. Next slide, please. So with the change to our climate system, we have been thinking a lot more about the health impacts of that change. This is something that for the last 50 years, we've really had people thinking about, certainly since the identification of global warming more aggressively in the 1970s, and including the coining of the term global warming. People have been thinking about what are the impacts on human health, and in particular on infectious diseases, things like malaria, as a result of changes to our climate system. Next slide, please. So to contextualize it and put everybody on the same page, though I may be preaching to the choir, let's just look at some of the information about how the planet is warming. So these are reconstructions of temperature going back to 1850, and these are temperature anomalies shown here relative to the 1850 to 1900 average from various institutes around the world, from China, Japan, Europe, and the US, and the UK. And you can see that the reconstructions of temperature are fairly consistent with one another. Early on, if you go into the 19th century, there you can see that there's more uncertainty. The uncertainty interval is only shown for the Berkeley Earth reconstruction. And then as we move forward into the later parts of the 20th century, we see that the lines converge to one another. The uncertainty around the Berkeley estimate is narrower. And of course, we see moving from around 1970 onward, this pronounced increase in temperatures, such that the temperature anomaly on average is above 1.4 degrees Celsius. Next slide, please. If we look at more recently what's been going on, and this has been a little bit more alarming, we can see what the estimated temperatures, and these are the average temperature anomaly, again, relative to 1850-1900 base period here, for each year, collections of years. Earlier years, really before 2015, are to the left and they're below 1 degree. And then you can see there's a cluster from 2015 to 2022 that were really between about 1.1 and 1.3 degrees Celsius of warming anomalously. And then when we hit 2023, there was an El Nino that developed in the middle of the year, and there was another pronounced jump. And we saw increases in temperatures in the latter half of the year that were 0.3 degrees Celsius higher than had ever been really recorded for a given month on average. And we've been in this sort of realm since. You can see the 3 most recent years there, and they're all between 1.4 and 1.6 degrees warmer than that 1850 to 1900 baseline period. Next slide. And of course, we believe this is driven by anthropogenic climate change, changes in the greenhouse gas composition of the atmosphere. This is a long view of it showing an 800,000 year record of carbon dioxide. Most of the reconstruction comes from ice core data. These are the small bubbles trapped within the ice in places like Greenland and Antarctica, where you can get very long time records as you drill down back through history. And you can see that during the time span before the Industrial Revolution, CO2 levels at the Earth really were between about 180 and 300 parts per million. And then once we moved into the Industrial Revolution era, we moved above 300 around 1911. and today we're above 420. So we've seen a very large excursion that's not consistent with what we had seen in association with the previous 800,000 years when we were going through various ice ages. Next slide. So the changes to that climate system, the radiative forcing and the associated changes to temperatures, the hydrologic cycle, have a lot of impacts on climate and extreme weather. One of the things that is manifesting is we are seeing more extreme weather, more instances of intense storms. The intensity of the storms are increasing. Flooding events are proving to be higher. We see rates of 100-year floods that instead are happening every 10 years or maybe more frequent. And there are also drought periods that are taking place that we're seeing in many portions of the world. Next slide. Another example would be sea level rise. And what you see in the upper left here with the warming of the temperatures in the atmosphere, the oceans are warming as well. And the oceans are expanding and rising for two reasons. One is thermal expansion, though it is a liquid and we think of it as incompressible, it's only fairly incompressible. And there has been considerable increase in sea level height just from the thermal expansion because of rising temperatures of the oceans. And in addition, with the melting of the glaciers, we're also adding water into the ocean basins. So with that, this is just a projection. If what would happen if you had 5 meters and then 10 meters of increase in sea level height, what would happen to peninsular Florida? And you can see that the Everglades would be wiped out and much of South Florida would disappear. And we see some of the risks of that already in South Florida. That shot on the lower right shows Miami with a tidal flood. So the lower portion of Florida, the peninsular area, much of it is limestone, which is very porous. And that means when there is a high tide, it doesn't have to come up over seawalls. It just percolates through the limestone and can come up through the streets and the subsurface directly into places like Miami. And that's what you're seeing there. That flooding is actually seawater that's come up. This is not the result of a rain event. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. Another problem with changes with increasing temperatures and changes in the hydrologic cycle is that it's changing and altering fire regimes. We see this in Indonesia, we see it in Mediterranean basis, and we certainly see it in the American West, and particularly in California. With intense rainfalls, you can get blooming in the desert, like we had a few years ago in California. All that primary productivity eventually dries out when the water goes away and it becomes kindling for fires, elevated temperatures, and other storm activity, lightning strikes, changes in wind circulation. All these can actually impact the area and result in changes in the distribution, but we're seeing a lot of fire risk take place as well. Next slide, please. And one other thing that I'll add, and the list could be very long here, is we can also see disruptions to food security, changes to our climate system, changes with extreme weather, alters our ability to grow food. Having consistent, reliable temperatures and water availability that is predictable is something that really laid the groundwork for humans to stop being nomadic and to settle down and actually dedicate themselves to agriculture and localized animal husbandry. When that reliability goes away, that's problematic, and that really affects food security, water security, and of course that has a lot of downstream effects as well. Next slide, please. So one of the things that I would stress here is that the idea that climate change and extreme weather will affect health is a bit of a nomer because it is already affecting health. If you interview emergency clinicians around the country in the US and worldwide, they will say they are already seeing the health impacts of climate change and extreme weather. And those health outcomes you can see here, they're listed here. The ones in red are the ones that really have keys to infectious diseases that are related to them in either directly or indirectly. And I would even add that the last one with the intergenerational effects may also be related to infectious diseases. So clearly death is an outcome that we see that will be changed because of infectious disease patterns that have been altered by climate change. The shifting disease patterns that are infectious most certainly will. Under and malnutrition will as well, as disease patterns affect agronomy, they affect other ecosystem services that lead into foodstuffs and the abilities for people to feed themselves. This too will affect child development. Children and their disease burden enormously affects their development physically, neurologically, etc. It feeds into hunger and thirst, precarity and insecurity, forced migration, unrest, and conflict. Next slide, please. So I would argue that if we're going to study the health impacts of climate change and extreme weather, that it really requires more research across scales and disciplines. And this is one way that I and other colleagues have broken this down to think about it. I think it needs to be approached from a number of sectors. The first is cellularly and molecularly. We need systems biology, exposomic approaches that are actually laboratory based to understand what happens to systems when they're exposed to shocks, when they're exposed to extreme variability in conditions, and what that means for organ systems, what that means for neurodevelopment and neurodecline. These are really rife areas that have been underexplored, and it's been difficult for institutes like the NIH to get their mind about this for quite some time, and they're just starting to do so, and I hope they will continue to do so. Another on the left is to study it at human population levels. This is something that I think we're a little more familiar with. Epidemiological approaches, such as what Dr. Adams talked about, looking at extrinsic health outcomes, extrinsic consequences, resilience, vulnerability, et cetera. The third is to bring in modeling and to think about what we can do in terms of Earth system modeling, bringing in bioinformatics, dynamic modeling, AI, big data, et cetera. And the last is the thing in the middle, which is to think about it as a complex system, where we need to unify the systems biology and population level data to understand the aggregate impacts and tipping points. This may be the hardest part of it all, where some of the studies tend to be very idiosyncratic and maybe not generalizable, but are very important for shaping our understanding of a particular system. Next slide, please. So just to go into a little more detail about this, the study of the cellular molecular biology and climate change, I really think about it from the exposome. And the exposome is really defined as the collective physical, chemical, biological, and psychosocial exposures that an individual organism experiences over their life course and what the implications are for their health. For human beings, it gets very complicated because we have the natural and the built environment. Our ecosystems include food and alcohol outlets, that includes our population density, the walkability, and how much green and blue space it is. Our lifestyle feeds into it, how we're sleeping, what our diet is, what our drug use is, smoking and alcohol use. It also includes social, what's our income levels, what about the inequality, our social capital, cultural norms, etc. And then, of course, the parts that will relate to extreme weather and climate, the physical chemical, temperature and humidity, light, odor, noise, outdoor and indoor air pollution, etc. There's a whole long list here. Next slide, please. And that exposome, those exposures affects the human condition across a range of scales that people look at, the omics scales. It affects our epigenomics and how we modify and express our genome. It affects the microbiome, which we cohabitate with within our guts, on our skin, and in many other portions of our body. It affects our metabolomics, our proteomics, our transcriptomics, and our genomics. And of course, then we can get up to organ systems and larger systems as well. These need to be collectively understood. And there needs to be sort of an integrated assessment as well as individual exploration of how the exposure to temperature and humidity and precipitation and the variability and air pollution and wind are affecting these systems. Next slide, please. At the population scale, we're really talking about some of the things that Dr. Ernst and Dr. Quinn talked about, Dr. Adams talked about, excuse me. Next slide. Dr. Ernst, you're going to have to forgive me. I got a very similar example here. Next slide, please. And this is from a study that was done and published in 2018, looking at Lesotho, where this is done by ICAP at Columbia University, where they were looking at drought and health behaviors. And they did a survey of almost 9,000 households and almost 13,000 adults. They took blood samples from almost 12,000 of them. It's a hyper-endemic HIV area with epidemic HIV occurrences. The prevalence in adults was over 25%. And this survey was conducted after an historic drought from 2014 to 2016. Next slide, please. And similar to what Dr. Ernst reported, 94% of the households they looked at were in areas affected by severe drought. The women in the urban areas impacted by severe drought reported increased history of selling sex, increased forced sex. Young women reported more intergenerational and transactional sex. and adolescent girls in rural drought areas reported earlier sexual debut, were more likely to be married, and were more likely to be HIV positive. So we often think about the impacts of climate on infectious diseases when we think about things like flu or West Nile virus or malaria or diarrheal disease. And here, again, I'm reiterating what Dr. Ernst said, is something where we can see how the social structure and food insecurity and water insecurity and a lack of resources and capital is changing the behavior patterns and the life calculations of women in this area, and how they get about to get by, and what that means then for the transmission of HIV. Next slide, please. Just switching to that third element, we also have these computational studies, as I talked about, that looked at the impacts of climate change and extreme weather. This uses a variety of tools, everything from global climate models and Earth system models down to simple toy models of disease systems and infectious diseases. Next slide, please. I'm going to give you one other example here of something that I found very interesting. This was research led by Barbara Hahn at the Carey Institute, where she looked at rodent species throughout the world that have been identified as reservoirs of zoonotic diseases. And she used a machine learning interrogation protocol to look at all the rodent species that really hadn't been studied, and to classify types and look at trait profiles, complexes of biological features that were similar among rodents that had been identified as reservoirs and those that had never been explored. And using this, they were able to identify what they thought were candidate rodents that might be, because of their trait profiles, organisms that harbored infectious diseases that were of threat to either animal husbandry or humans. And since then, they've used this to actually target some of their efforts and found, in fact, reservoirs of diseases that do need to be noted and looked at. Next slide, please. So, this gets to the middle thing, which is sort of the complex system analysis, and the health impacts of climate change and extreme weather are wicked problems. They have a lot of interdependencies. They're often multi-causal and socially complex pathways that have to be delineated. And they lead to unforeseen consequences, often include behavioral changes, and the solutions that we have to dealing with this will rarely sit within the responsibility of one traditional discipline. So it really requires researchers to get out of their comfort zones and talk to one another and learn each other's languages and approaches in order to address these effectively. Next slide, please. One example I would say, and this is a relatively simple example, is during COVID-19. The US was, of course, severely impacted by that. And at the same time in the summer, we had wildfires out west, and we had hurricane landfalls in the southeast. And what does it mean when you have populations that have evacuation orders and are being forced to migrate when you have distancing measures in place at the same time? How do you actually address this? What are the implications? And what does this do to your control of the infectious disease system? Next slide. So for these complex systems, and we can talk about a lot of other ones, in the lower right, it shows Lake Chad, which was this transnational lake that spanned 5 countries in Central Africa and has enormously shrunk, both due to climate variability and change, but also due to siphoning of water off, changes in practices. It's transnational, there's multicultural reasons, many different tribes and languages, and there's a lot of conflict in the area as well, all of which has fed into the loss of this resource and the ability of the locals in this area to feed themselves. So the reductionist single issue solutions are going to be at best bandages for dealing with a problem such as this. And what we need really is cutting edge public health science that intersects with other disciplines, engineering, policy. You can name a lot of other disciplines that could be brought into this well, and so that we can understand the whole as well as the parts of the problem. And the challenge will be for these is to identify tractable problems in this space. We have a lot of tools to explore it, but we certainly will need the resources and, again, a little bit of the patience to talk across disciplines to analyze systems such as this. Next slide, please. So that was my last, and I know we're taking questions at the end, so I will cede my time. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. So let me introduce our last speaker, Dr. Alexander Travis. So Dr. Travis is a chair of the Department of Public and Ecosystem Health and a professor of reproductive biology at the Cornell University College of Veterinary Medicine, as well as director of Cornell Public Health, where he leads interdisciplinary efforts grounded in a One Health framework that connects human, animal, and environmental health. His work includes infectious disease, wildlife health, and sustained food systems, with a focus on addressing complex at the intersection of ecosystem change, emerging health threats, and population health. So let me hand it over to Dr. Thank you.
Thank you. So as we've just seen in all those very nice presentations, human health depends on the health of the environment and the interplay of weather, land use patterns, arthropods that can carry infections, the ecology of different reservoir and host species, the pathogens themselves, and people. Next slide. One Health is a paradigm that lets us understand the complex interplay of all these factors and how humans interact with both the living and non-living components of the environment. This is typically drawn, as I do here, a circle, sometimes as a triangle, but the idea is to show that when we have an interaction with one dimension, we're actually affecting the entire system. But when we decide how to interact with the environment, that's not taking place in a vacuum. Next slide. Whether we decide to plant a forest or cut down a forest, use pesticides or use crops that have been modified to be resistant to pests, those choices are all shaped by demographic, economic, cultural, political forces, excuse me, a variety of different social inputs. Next slide. And those decisions, of course, have consequences and feedbacks. On the left, you see some of the things that we lose, whether it's soil, forest cover, food species, particularly, say, marine species, ecosystem services that often protect us from disease without us realizing it until they're gone. And then on the right, the things that are changing, including extreme weather events, increasing in incidence and severity, emerging disease, spread of invasive species, human migration, etc. These things all feed back on our health. And next slide. And as we've all seen in real life, in real time the past few years, when our health is affected at scale, that affects every aspect of our society. And so this is a complex One Health systems approach. And this is the way I teach this to all of our public health students and also our veterinary students. Next slide. So One Health is a paradigm, right? It's a way of understanding, of connecting these different events. And it's not just disease transmission across species barriers. That's just the small slice of it that is often emphasized. Next slide. One Health is also an approach, and we just heard this, Jeffery, very nicely in the last presentation. To solve the health challenges of our time, we cannot take a traditional academic approach of working within disciplines. We have to work across disciplines, sectors, and scales. No scientist, no discipline can solve this on our own. We have to work outside of academia, with industry, with government, and NGOs. And we also have to understand our ecosystems and how they function better, because often we can protect our health most efficiently by preserving natural systems that are there and that we've evolved with. Next slide, please. So it's my pleasure to be PI on our P20 center, which is called the Center for Transformative Infectious Disease Research. This is part of a larger center or undertaking here at Cornell known as C-Change. And our first project is led by Dr. Raina Plowright, who's a great example of a One Health practitioner, veterinarian, immunologist, epidemiologist. And Dr. Plowright has led the creation of the first models that have been shown to be predictive for when Henipa viruses, so Hendra virus being an example, will jump from fruit bats, you see the picture here, into horses and then people. And Dr. Plowright integrates data on wildlife health, stress and malnutrition of these bats with changes in weather, both extreme weather events and weather cycles, changes in land use, including what species of trees are left in rainforests, and that flower at specific times of the year. Next slide. So Dr. Plowright has found that during extreme weather cycles and events, the flowering of trees is limited. The bats become nutritionally stressed, and then they are forced to move into agricultural areas where they don't want to be, but it's where they can acquire some lower quality food. And this leads to exposure that cause spillovers. When the native forest trees are there and flowering, the spillovers don't occur. And what they've done is use radar here to really document on an individual bat level, like the movement of bats during the course of a night under different weather conditions. Next slide. So they're taking this down into the immunology of the bats themselves, looking again at these extreme weather events and patterns of viral shedding and changes in the immune response of the bats. And you can see in the panels on the right for a number of different species of potential zoonotic interest. Next slide, please. Our second project is led by Dr. Laura Goodman, and this looks at tick-borne diseases across New York City, New York State. And Dr. Goodman uses pathogen-agnostic hybrid capture panels to see what diseases an invasive species of tick, the Asian longhorn tick, I have a photo of that here, are carrying. This utilizes citizen science, trained volunteers to collect ticks from different areas. And Dr. Goodman has found 2 diseases not previously identified before in North America, including a novel chimeric flavivirus. So this is an approach to find out what is out there, because as we experience different weather events, species like the Asian longhorn tick, which is invasive, also happens to be parthenogenetic. And so it can actually self-propagate and is actively moving northward. I think it was originally in New Jersey in 2017 and is now moving northward through New York State. Next slide. Dr. Goodman's also mixing in the ecological and molecular evolution perspectives, and we heard a bit of that in the last presentation. And she's looking at the seroprevalence of different diseases. In this case, on the left, you see the serology results from a tick-borne encephalitis virus in different wildlife species within New York City, which could be acting as vectors. And in this case, 80% of the raccoons are seropositive, especially in Staten Island, which has a very high tick burden. And she's using a real One Health approach, using DNA barcoding then to figure out what species the ticks are feeding on. So what was their last blood meal? And then this pathogen agnostic approach to let her find things that would be missed by ordinary PCR. And for example, she's found a variant of Babesia in raccoons that's divergent in COX-1 and the major surface antigen SA1. And so we need physicians, to be working, as I said, with veterinarians, entomologists, parasitologists, virologists, epidemiologists, and that isn't enough. We really need ecologists. We need social scientists with expertise in economics, communication, inequities, health systems, access to healthcare, and policy, along with the climate scientists and earth scientists who can then all together create predictive models. Next slide, please. So one of the cores of our P20 is called the Living Evidence and Applied Data Modeling Core, and this is led by Drs. Anna Bento, Alistair Hayden, and Laura Smith. And this slide, I'm not going to go through it, but just describes some of the factors that are necessary to create these predictive models. And what was really nice is we saw a lot of examples of this in the prior talks with, for example, in Maricopa County, where are the green spaces? How does that affect the ability of mosquitoes to live there? How does ground cover affect whether ticks can overwinter in an area? Because humidity, it's not just temperature, humidity at the ground level is a critical factor. What other species are mesopredators present in a forest system that change the behavior of ticks and also act to clean them off and reduce numbers? So all of these factors are key parts of One Health dynamic systems models. And you can see those here on the top left. So we need to go beyond just focusing on the human health, the biomedical approach, medicine, and the social sciences policy, but also incorporate now areas of classical ecology. And then these models can help us, as Dr. Adams said, get to predictive models where we can really look at hotspots, which will enable preparation and prevention. Next slide, please. Our community engagement core on the P20 is led by Dr. Jen Meredith. And here I'd like to make a special plug for rural communities, because often we focus on the cities. And of course that makes sense. It's the majority of our population. They're often on coasts, they're often next to rivers, they're very susceptible to extreme weather events. They're also susceptible to extreme heat with heat island effects as well. But our rural communities tend to have aging populations, they have lower wealth, which means a lower tax base. They have lower percentage of the population has college education, lower vaccine rates, higher chronic illness, and of course lower access to care, higher percentage without insurance. All of these factors combine to make community scale approaches more challenging, especially in light of the fact that people are more dispersed through the landscape. And so things that we might think about in an urban environment, such as establishing a cooling center, become very challenging when we're talking about a highly dispersed rural population. Next slide. So just to tie things together, I think we've seen that viral pathogen spillover events and the spread of vector-borne diseases alike are rising due to this increasing incidence and severity of extreme weather events. Next slide. Using a One Health approach, which I think all of our speakers actually were doing today, we can integrate data regarding behavior of people and non-human animals, and including the arthropod vectors, ecology, weather, land use, human and animal health, as well as what's going on at the molecular level on the genomes of both the vectors and the pathogens into predictive epidemiological models. And then the purpose, really goal of our center is to move upstream. We have to change research and practice from reactive response to outbreaks to proactive prevention and preparation. In public health, we often think of primary prevention as vaccines, but now with improved understanding of weather and ecology, we can actually hopefully go upstream and prevent those spillovers and outbreaks from happening in the first place. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. So now we would like to move on to the panel discussion. So we have some prepared questions, and we would love to hear from some or all of the speakers for each question. So let me start with the first question. So it's about the compound events. So many extreme weather events are increasingly happening at the same time. For example, heat waves during droughts or flooding that happens right after wildfires. So we were wondering if our models have been capturing such compound effects of multiple extreme weather events, and if not, how we should address these compound impact of multiple extreme events. Does anybody have an idea on that?
I'm happy to take an initial stab at that. I could say within the climate community, certainly, there is study and analysis of compound extreme events. They're thinking about, what happens when you get the 3 sigma, 4 sigma, 7 sigma event. And then what happens when you get those at the same time, which is, I think, what the questioner is alluding to. So people have begun to piece it together, and you could take sort of a reductionist approach and think, well, what about combinations of different types of events I can imagine? But they're also trying to think about it in a more structural way. Certainly, within climate models, that kind of compound event is being captured. It's in the evidentiary record. It's physically capable of being modeled. Now, how we look at that in terms of what we do to see how it affects health, how it affects One Health systems, if you will, as Dr. Travis talked about, I think that's really incumbent on us in the field. Now, there are people who've started to investigate this. So I just think that we need to be a little bit more mindful of it and not only look at marginal effects. And that may get to the same message, I would argue, that we don't want to just look at extreme weather and a particular health outcome. Think of the entire system that it exists in. What are the other drivers, social, biological, and physical, that you really need to think about when you're analyzing them? And that can be multiple events as well.
Anyone else? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, if I could also add, in addition to the modeling, which honestly, takes some time, right, to generate those data and identify whether the models will be predictive, I think we also need to think about practice and working with our county health departments, our state partners, government partners, so that we can help our colleagues prepare for these different events, because oftentimes we need policy changes, right? We need to set things in place in advance. The disaster is not the time to be, I'll date myself by exchanging business cards, right? But getting that contact list on your phone, right? We need to be doing that ground game ahead of time, bringing different sectors, different parts of government together with academia, so we can be a little proactive in preparing for these events, because they will happen.
Anyone else want to comment?
I would just add, I think that there's specific disease systems in which we know that there are interactions between sort of combined events. It's pretty well established, I think, now that sort of the drought and then heavy precipitation combination drives West Nile virus outbreaks in many instances. This sort of drought flood combination seems to be one of the most robust sort of combinations that's been investigated. And so I think, it affects fecal oral transmission. It affects other disease dynamics as well. So I think we also, I would argue, need to still be doing field work. So, we need to be able to actually look at what's happening post-event, and that requires investment and resources to do that, right? Because if you don't have a robust surveillance system while you're monitoring what's happening with different extreme weather events, you're not going to be able to actually capture what the impact is. So I would echo sort of this need for both shoring up surveillance, public health, et cetera, so that we can actually establish those relationships more firmly, and then really sort of work with our public health partners so that we can create these actionable models that can help sort of provide insights as to what might be happening after these compound events.
Can I ask sort of a follow-on question, I guess, for Dr. Ernst? I mean, I was interested in the sort of drought or rain, heavy rainfall association with dengue, and dengue has been really increasing worldwide over the last decade or more, and we have more tools for control. We have maybe 2 vaccines. I mean, one's only approved in Brazil, but then we have Wolbachia-infected mosquitoes. That takes a little more time to implement. We've got other anti-vector measures that can be more directly applied and more rapidly. What are your thoughts about trying to sort of use those, what you've learned, to be able to forewarn public health authorities, and also like how much lead time would you be able to give them if by sort of tracking weather patterns? Because we know dengue's there, it's going to explode. It's I think for other diseases we need really good surveillance in place, but dengue just keeps coming back.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the evidence that we have so far really points toward that sort of 4 to 6 week windows, sort of post a heavy precipitation event leading to sort of excess or increases in dengue. Does that hold true in every geography or every sort of instance? We don't know. So I think that always complicates things, is that certainty with which you can provide that information to your partners, because there's of course the danger of doing nothing, which means that you have this increased transmission, and then if you deploy resources and it really wasn't going to be as significant an increase, you also are having a converse sort of cost as well. So I think there are certainly ways that this can be done. I think it requires that partnership with the public health folks to see what level of uncertainty they're willing to sort of take on. And I know Dr. Adams and Dr. Travis are both sort of talking about some of those things, and I know Dr. Shaman does too. So I think yes, that's where we need to move, is more of a proactive response if we're going to start addressing these issues. So I don't know if that answered your question.
No, that's helpful. I think the communication with, the sort of collaboration with public health authorities and being able to share information and predictions, but with a certain degree of uncertainty, I think it's necessary because they have to be prepared as well. Part of the problem is, like, as you said, resources. If you don't have, sufficient resources to either do the surveillance or to monitor and predict or to respond, then nothing's going to happen.
Yeah, related to that, we also wanted to ask about the partnership with the public health practitioners, such as State Department of Public Health or Ministry of Health. We talked a lot about the prediction models, forecasting models. We would really love to hear your experience with public health practitioners, how your models or prediction results have been used by Ministry of Health or government agencies to inform their decision making. And if that hasn't happened to your model yet, I would love to hear what are the challenges to make your models used by public health practitioners.
I can maybe start on this one. I think that's one of the biggest challenges, in the position that I'm in right now was built on a really strong relationship between NOAA and CDC. So my predecessors were kind of sitting under both agencies, which means that now we still have very strong relationships with CDC, who are able to inform us about the priorities specifically for West Nile forecasting. But I recently was at CDC's Vector Week, where we were able to actually talk directly with county health officials who were able to inform us how our models would be useful to them and what kind of information is actually useful at what time frame, what levels of uncertainty they're able to accept, and how they would go about integrating an academic type of model into their actual systems. And there's a lot of eagerness on both sides to work together, but there's certainly this disconnect with how we actually, get the data in a time that makes sense for us to actually produce prospective forecasts in a way that's useful for them. That's a really big problem. They're even looking at, how do we produce nowcasts so that we can kind of catch up for the reporting delays that exist. So I think that kind of data gap is a really big struggle, but also just the communication problem is, we sit in our own silos, which has been a really big challenge. But to see that there's eagerness on both sides, I think is encouraging.
Can I ask another question? Thanks, Quinn. That's helpful to hear about the conversations you've been having. There are, sort of hints that this year might have a really strong El Nino. And I'm wondering what you all anticipate could be, both, in the United States in terms of vector-borne disease, but also in Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa. There's different impacts in different parts of the world every time we have a really strong El Nino. But I'm wondering, what you anticipate, And then, is there anything we can do to sort of be better prepared to try and communicate with our public health authority counterparts? That was a challenging.
It's a good question. It's a broad one, David, but you sort of hit on one of the tricky parts of it. El Nino variability has teleconnections throughout the world, which are these large waves in the atmosphere that produce changes in storm tracks and pressure patterns and the temperatures and rainfall frequencies that are expected throughout the world. And it's just sort of shifts in the probability, and the impacts are differential. Some places get colder, some places get warmer, some places get wetter, some places get drier, some places have no effect whatsoever. And it varies from El Nino to El Nino. So it's difficult to pin on it. We did research with a doctoral student of mine who's now at UCSD. Her name's Alexandra Haney, looking at what happens to diarrhea in Botswana due to the teleconnection there between El Nino and what it does to floods and rainwater and such in the whole river system there. And, there's a large animal-human interface right there, very One Health, if you will. So the differences are variable. This is something traditionally when things were a little more stable in the federal government, the places like UCAR and NOAA and the National Weather Service would be really talking about quite a bit. And we would be looking at the experts locally who understood what might be the impacts on local agricultural systems or disease systems. Now, not all of those have been mapped out, but it's a highly variable. And it's going to be a question of the intensity and the form of El Nino if it does indeed develop. That will happen. One thing that will happen if there's an El Nino is we'll see probably another jump in temperature. That temperature record, how we saw blocks of years in that slide, that happens when we have an El Nino event. If I could go back to the question Dr. Shioda asked for a second, just to say that I have done a lot of work working with CDC, local governments, ministries of health around developing forecasting systems and early warning systems. Most of them haven't been climate-based. Most of them have been dynamical. It requires a lot of work. We worked with the CDC on the first flu forecasting system that we developed almost 15 years ago. And at first they were very skeptical of it. And then eventually they started doing a competition about it because I convinced them, because I was sending them real-time forecasts to the head of flu surveillance there, and regardless of whether she wanted to read them, but halfway through the season, she said, keep sending these, I like them. And the next year they did a competition, and they've continued to do competitions for it. And a consequence of that and work in the field, not just by me, but by others, was the Center for Forecasting and Outbreak Analytics at the CDC. Now, I'm not going to argue that that's stable right now. It's under threat, but that is a very logical platform within the U.S. to build this out. I think it's under threat because they removed the director already, and we're already seeing things like UCAR and the National Weather Service under threat to be privatized. But having systems like that in place are really important. I've worked a lot with local people and such, and building those relationships is really imperative. In COVID, I didn't even have to reach out to the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. They reached out to me in January and said, let's get an MOU signed so we can give you your data so you can do forecasting and projections and analysis of this disease that's coming our way. And by the time the first cases arrived in New York City, we were already up and running. So that was, those are the types of things you really want to build.
If I could go back to that question too, just to say, some of our faculty who work in these spaces, like Dr. Plowright, has, her work, she's gone out of her way to bring that to different governments and intergovernmental authorities like the WHO, who've integrated that for the first time, that kind of like moving upstream with ecological understanding into the pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response agreement. And she's co-chairing a Lancet Commission on viral pathogen spillover. So, but it takes an enormous amount of effort beyond your laboratory, beyond your traditional academic efforts. And so, that's kind of international, but even at the state level, what we found in New York State is it's not just the Department of Health or the Department of Environmental Conservation or the Department of Agriculture and Markets, it's also the Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Services. All of them have extreme weather under and change and outbreaks under their purview. And they're all working on these things. And sometimes convening our partners at the state level is also a really, really effective tool.
I'm sorry, I was going to add briefly, I think working with our public health partners is really important and critical. I also think there's some opportunities to directly sort of speak to the public. Because there's, it's like a game of telephone. If you're telling the health department tells the public. And so I think that, there's also opportunities for building connections with organizations like community health workers, with direct sort of public leaders who are either conveying the message or direct messaging to the public. And it doesn't have to be overly complex, right? It can be paired with an action message. So it looks like we might have a higher, vector season this year. Make sure you are reducing the containers in your yard. So pairing that sort of early warning message that's general and simple with an actual action-oriented message that's going to probably help them regardless of if it's a really bad season or sort of a moderate season, I think can also be a really effective strategy.
Good.
Oh, thank you.
Kayoko, do you have an additional question?
Yes, I do have more questions I would love to ask. So I'm a veterinarian by training, so I think a lot about animals as well. And climate change also affects animals and wildlife, and lots of emerging infectious diseases are zoonotic diseases. And we have some surveillance for mosquitoes and ticks, like vectors. But do we think we are capturing enough animal reservoirs or intermediate hosts? Like when we think about the West Nile virus, horses and birds, they play very important roles. So I was just wondering if we are doing enough for these animal reservoirs, intermediate hosts in the prediction model that we have. And if not, how can we do better? What kind of data or surveillance or anything else that we should be doing to capture animal aspects of it that is also affected by climate change?
I can start with the West Nile story, perhaps. West Nile is particularly challenging with birds as the main host, and especially migratory birds, because they are quite challenging to capture if you are able to capture them whatsoever. So what you do is you take birds that have died and test them for West Nile, and then kind of get an abundance that way. And I don't exactly know what the solution would be. Maybe Dr. Travis has some thoughts on this. But it does make it really challenging because this is a really important intermediate step between vector and human transmission of disease. And without that information, we kind of are missing this whole side of the story. And I know that with horses as well, with West Nile, a lot of states have stopped kind of tracking that information because of the vaccine. It becomes really useful. And so states that are having, West Nile kind of emerging now, they are tracking horse cases, but in other states they're not. So there's a lot of discrepancy spatially on how these data are captured as well.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Adams. I agree. It's really a multi-pronged question. So we need surveillance, and also, again, this like pathogen agnostic surveillance, right? We need to find out what's out there, not just the things that we think or suspect. And with again, New York City is now a subtropical climate, and so what we previously thought of as transboundary diseases or international diseases, things that we taught, but you're not going to see this, so we're only going to expose you to it very briefly. We might encounter those things more, so we need to think differently. And we have prepared a lot of training exercises to bring people together from these different parts of government, so that the physicians and the veterinarians can integrate more. And again, that requires a lot of ground game. So we run our College of Veterinary Medicine runs a wildlife health program for New York State, which is really an essential linchpin between the agricultural species, the wildlife species, and human health. And so making those connections is really essential. But we need to be looking at the reservoirs, not just the vectors, to really understand things. And in many cases, and David, going back to your question, which had more of an international component as well, unfortunately, in many cases, we don't know the disease ecology. We don't know all the species that are in these systems. So we need a lot more work on this. And again, unfortunately, I mean, it's easier to solve problems where they are instead of waiting for them to come here and then not knowing how to deal with something and trying to figure it out on the fly, right? And so my own lab does a lot of work on ultra rapid diagnostics and point of care type work, so we can answer some of these questions. If you have, for example, if one training I use a lot is Rift Valley fever, something we don't have here. Most of the patients seem to have flu. Then you might have a couple encephalitis cases, but everything we would look for normally would be negative, right? And then it would be only if you were talking to, say, the veterinarians who were to be having abortion events on their farms or something that you might begin to piece this together. And so maybe you had a couple cases that were hemorrhagic in nature, and then you piece it together. So we need to get these trainings, I think, ahead of time.
So I just want to add two points to that conversation. One is, I think that one of the additional things we need is something that Dr. Shaman alluded to, which is we need to understand the impacts of these stressors on the biology of the reservoirs as well. So how does it increase their susceptibility? How does it change their shedding of the virus, et cetera? Because if you have an increased probability of transmission, you have an increased probability of an epizootic and spillover events, et cetera. So I think that's one area that's been underexplored in terms of sort of that weather infectious disease pathway. And the other thing I would say is I think surveillance, I'm going to hit again on this community piece. So I think that community-based participatory surveillance strategies can be really useful for things like this, because you can't have personnel everywhere, but if you have public who are reporting things like they're having livestock who are having more abortion events and this kind of thing, that can actually be sort of that grassroots level of information. And of course, there's potential reliability issues, but there's some frameworks in place. We have the Ending Pandemics Academy here, which does a lot of that community-based participatory surveillance from a One Health perspective in low, middle, and high income countries that I think can serve as a model for some of this enhanced surveillance.
Great, thank you. We're actually doing a really great job at keeping everything on time. So I think we have time to take questions from the audience. Nick, can the audience just unmute themselves and ask questions, or are they supposed to type it in the Q&A?
Yes, so they can. So if you guys want to ask a question, you can go ahead and just type that either in the Q&A or the chat. You guys can't unmute yourself, but you can do it right in the Q&A. So we'll give you some time for that. Maybe if you want to ask another question to the panelists while we wait for some questions to come in.
Okay, yeah, that sounds great. The last question we wanted to ask was, looking ahead, what do you think are the most exciting or underexplored directions for research at the intersection of extreme weather events and infectious diseases? I would love to hear from each of you. That would be great. And while the panelists are answering the question, we are happy to take questions from the audience. So if the participants can type their questions either in a chat or Q&A box, I would be happy to read those. I mean, there was one from Yuki Kiyomoto, which I think Quinn has already answered, right?
Yeah, that was a pretty technical, analytical approach type question.
Yeah, but that was great. I really loved reading that. So thank you for a great conversation. But while we are waiting for questions from the audience, if anybody wants to answer that last question, like, what are the most exciting or underexplored directions for research at the intersection of extreme weather events and infectious diseases? We would love to hear your thoughts on that.
I guess I can take a stab at it. I don't know if I have any one. I think there's so many topics, but I do think that trying to get your hands around compound events and extreme events is really important for understanding what happens. Very often it's not the gradual changes and shifts to mean, though those can be very important, but it's the higher mode changes that really can drive system change in all sorts of systems, and certainly in infectious diseases. So I think looking at those, and that gets to sort of these complex systems, and figuring out how to systematize it and understand that would be really fantastic for getting insight. Requires resources. We've alluded to that. Really requires resources, observations, and money.
So I guess I'll go next. So I think one of the most exciting things to me is understanding adaptation and resilience strategies. So how do we take an approach that is much more sort of holistic? So for example, nature-based solutions that have been implemented and deployed in different areas. How do we actually measure and quantify the potential impacts on both those, the ability of those to sort of absorb shocks and stressors like extreme weather events, and then to promote sort of in those in-between times, reductions in infectious disease transmission as well. And, you know, I think this could be anything from having more green spaces and or increasing biodiversity or reducing biodiversity loss, increasing mangrove sort of restoration for shoreline prevention. So how do those kinds of big picture ecosystem resilience strategies actually influence our resilience to infectious diseases as well? So that's an area I'm really excited and interested in exploring more.
Yeah, I would say one of the main things that our group is working on is the incorporation of weather and climate forecasting into our prediction models for disease. So subseasonal to seasonal weather forecasts, forecasts of ENSO, things like that, to see if we can extend our ability to predict further into the future. And also to test what the limits are of our model in introducing uncertainty, because we know that weather forecasts past several days are highly uncertain. So that's a really exciting avenue, but I also do love the concept of co-occurring and compounding hazards as an implementation explicitly into models. So those are kind of the two big ones that we have been thinking quite a bit about.
And I'll just say I agree with everything that's been said. I mean, the move towards nature-based solutions, we need more data, we need more examples, because it's different, right? It's mangroves in one area, it's oyster beds in another. But it's the same kind of principles that we can use. And again, you know, most people, you know, the example I use in class all the time is we have a lot of tick-borne disease here, Lyme, Anaplasma, Babesia. You know, if you go for a walk in the woods and there's possums in the woods, you're less likely to get bitten by a tick. And if you are bitten by a tick, you're less likely to get Lyme. No one really thinks about possums, raccoons, and skunks and foxes as protecting us from disease, but they have their role in the system. And I know it's complex, and I'm just giving a soundbite here, but we need to think more broadly about the factors that impact human health. And that's multidimensional, so that's kind of like a lifelong goal, I would say.
So it looks like there's a question for Quinn. Can you see that question, Quinn? Maybe
I can, yeah, and it's a really good question. So for those who maybe can't see it, do you have an explanation as to why one community in Brazil is more affected by El Nino compared to another, which happened to be more impacted by lagged cases, for example? Yeah, it's a terrific question. And my concept is that it probably relies pretty heavily on underlying susceptibility and also kind of land use characteristics. So things that aren't weather related that might increase susceptibility or vulnerability to a community. For example, if one community is more urbanized, there's more domestic dogs in that area that might contribute to higher transmission rates above and beyond the impacts of El Nino, for example. So it's that underlying socio-demographic and ecological relationships that might be driving transmission in one location. The other may be more impacted by El Nino just because of the landscape in that location. Surprisingly, São Luís is actually a coastal city, which is why it's interesting to me that, you know, that's the location that was driven primarily by lagged cases and not the El Nino Southern Oscillation. So it's a really good question. And I think that just points to the complexity of local drivers of disease risk.
Thank you. We have 2 more questions from the audience. I'm sorry, David.
Do you? I'm not seeing them. Is it in the Q&A? Oh.
Yeah, yes.
Okay.
We have 2 more, and then we have about 3 minutes left to answer those. So maybe keeping it a little bit short, your answers short. The first one was actually to Dr. Adams again, but what does it mean for a human footprint to be a predictor of the disease? What might that capturing?
Yeah, another really good question. The human footprint variable is like a combination of what it means for human impact on the environment. So it could be a combination of, you know, translation to croplands or urbanicity, essentially just human presence on the environment, and how those kind of co-collect to, produce disease risk, but a combination of things. It's not just urbanicity or, you know, deforestation. It's the combination.
Yeah, thank you. And the last question from the audience, it's about the use of ENSO and other climate variables to identify lead time for infectious disease risk. Once the risk is identified through prediction models or causal inference, what do you think climate health communication should look like in practice? People might underestimate the climate influence that will happen in the future. How should this information be translated into public health action and decision making in terms of ENSO? If anybody has a thought on that.
Yeah, I think about this a lot. You know, there are a lot of work that needs to be done in decision science. So we shouldn't be going into this lightly and pretend that we have all the information. It really requires a full partnering with the public health agencies. They do this for risk insurance. They do this for agricultural systems in Africa using seasonal forecasts and ENSO forecasts. And it really requires developing decision frameworks that are formalized and objectives. And this is something that is done regularly, industrial engineering and operations research and DSI, and those kinds of systems really should be put in place. And there needs to be a lot of dialogue and discussion so that the information isn't, oh, there's an 80% chance of rain, I'll take an umbrella, but something that is done more formally, because these are usually just shifts in probability distributions. And decisions need to be very well mapped so that you don't burn local stakeholders who are making really serious choices about their livelihood about this. So it's a very complex, large field that really requires bringing in different levels of expertise.
Any other additional comments from other speakers? Then probably we should wrap up.
Yeah.
Do you wanna...
Yes, yeah. Thank you so much for giving the really great presentations today. I truly enjoyed it, and hopefully the audience enjoyed it a lot too. So yeah, thank you so much for coming, and I will pass it to Nick.